Hello and welcome. It's Hagberg here for Team XRAY. In this video I will talk about the X4 top options, or the option parts that I really recommend you to use for different conditions, and I'll explain how to use them, when to use them, and why they are important. So let's start from the beginning. I'm going to put my X4 aside for now, and we're going to focus on the parts. First off, we're going to talk about anti-roll bars. So I have 3 anti-roll bars here. They're for the front of the car. 1.3, 1.2 and 1.1. The aluminum chassis kits come with a 1.4 front and 1.3 rear anti-roll bars. And if you want to generate more chassis roll from the car, you need to go softer. So you need to go to a 1.3 front anti-roll bar for the front to try and generate more front grip, to generate more mid-corner steering, and to make the car more aggressive. In general, we don't go softer than 1.3 in front on carpet, but for some conditions, especially lower bite conditions, you can try and use a 1.2 front roll bar. Same goes for asphalt racing. If you purchase the graphite kit version, then your kit comes with a 1.3 front and 1.2 rear anti-roll bar. And those are good as a base setting for most asphalt tracks, but if you want to try and generate more front grip, you can go to a 1.2 front roll bar. And sometimes even a 1.1 roll bar for conditions where you need a lot of steering, a lot of front bite, and where you need to make the front end roll a lot more. So those are important options to fine-tune the handling of the car, also for asphalt racing. So those are the roll bars that I recommend as options. You also have the option to purchase rear anti-roll bars, but in general, the anti-roll bar that comes with the kit for those specific kits is the best option for most tracks. You can sometimes go harder or softer, but in general, I tend to tune the car with the front anti-roll bar more so than the rear. Another part of the car which is extremely important for the handling is, of course, the shock springs. So the springs that come with the kit now are the hard progressive springs, so the 2.5 to 2.8, front and rear. And those springs, they provide a very good neutral handling to the car for most tracks. They give a lot of side bite and they make the car forgiving to drive. But in general, if you want to free up the car, to generate more corner speed, to make the rear end a little flatter, we recommend going to a linear rear spring. So generally we use a 2.6, 2.7 or 2.8 rear spring, depending on the track condition. So especially in spec classes, it can be a good idea to use a 2.6 rear spring. But in modified especially, we usually go up to a 2.7 rear spring to make the car a little flatter, to generate more forward bite, and to make the car more predictable. For some higher grip conditions or fast asphalt tracks where you want to stop the car from squatting as much in the rear, you can go up to a 2.8 rear spring, but it's usually within that range, 2.6 to 2.8 in the rear. You can also use a linear front spring on the car, but it's typically not recommended. It's not something that I personally like to use. It depends on your driving style. It will make the car a little less aggressive initially, and it will sometimes give the feeling of more front grip, but it's not something I typically use, but it can be good for certain driving styles and track conditions. I'll put the springs here, and we move on to the caster bushings. The kit comes with 2-dot caster bushings. So when the bushings are pointing to the front, in the rear, it means that you have 1.5 degrees of caster in the rear. But if you go to the optional 3-dot caster bushings, you can achieve 2.5 or 3.5 degrees of caster in the rear. And the same for the front, with the 2 dot pointing backwards, the dots pointing inwards in the car. So the dots pointing this way, it means that you have 4 degrees of front caster. But if you install the optional 3-dot caster insert, you can achieve 5 degrees of caster in the front, which makes the car more aggressive. You'll have more on-power steering. Is sometimes recommended for conditions where you need the car to be more aggressive coming out of the corner. But keep in mind that more caster in the front will make the car more prone to traction rolling. For the rear, the 3-dots are very popular because you can achieve more rear caster. So the point here is to move the upper arm towards the front of the car. What you do with the 3-dot insert, you achieve more rear caster. And what happens when you do that? The wheelbase becomes shorter, so you move the weight bias obviously a bit. And the shorter car also tends to enter the corner faster, be more initially aggressive, and can really help the car to turn on certain track layouts. So it's really a nice thing to have for fine-tuning the handling of the car to achieve more rear caster. And obviously these are eccentrics, you can turn them around, you can achieve either 2.5 or 3.5 degrees of caster, but you can also use these on the front of the car to achieve 5 degrees of front caster. So they're possible to use at both ends of the car. We also have 1-dot caster inserts for an even wider range of fine-tuning of the caster. Let's move on to the top decks. So we have these split top decks, which I really recommend these for asphalt racing. It's the #1 choice for the team when racing on asphalt surfaces, because they make the car a lot more flexible in the center area of the car here around the spur gear. And of course you also have the option to set the flex individually front and rear, because they have 2 screw holes here for the shoulder screws that come with the car. So you have 4 screws that you can use to install or take out to fine-tune the flex of the car. So split top decks, very much recommended for asphalt racing. And the 1.6 top deck. The kit comes with a 2.0 thickness top deck, which is installed on my car here. But for conditions where you run an aluminum chassis, either a solid chassis or an aluminum flex chassis, I recommend using the 1.6mm optional long top deck. So what happens to the handling when you install the long top deck? You increase the side bite of the car, you increase the traction, the mid-corner steering is increased, and basically it makes the car more aggressive. So a 1.6 top deck is preferable to use together with the aluminum chassis plates. It's generally too soft to use with the graphite chassis plates, so I recommend this solely for using with the aluminum chassis plates. Let's move on to the wheel hubs. These are offset wheel hubs, minus 0.5 millimeters, so they make the car 0.5 millimeters narrower on whichever end of the car where you install these. So you can buy these in pairs and use this individually front and rear. Making the car narrower is preferable for lower grip conditions where you need to have more initial steering, where you need the car to be more aggressive, and where you need it to turn more. So more so in modified than in stock racing. In general, for stock classes, it's good to use a bit wider track width to maintain better cornering speed, to not make the car so initially aggressive. But definitely for stock racing, the standard hexes are the best, but for modified, I recommend the optional narrow hexes, especially for low grip carpet and asphalt racing. Keep in mind that these hexes are narrower, so when you put the setup station onto the hex, it's not going to rest perfectly flat against the hex because of the little clip and the edge of the axle protruding in front of the hex. So that's why it comes with these little shims to be used in between the hex and the setup station. So don't forget to add these, otherwise you will not have an accurate camber measurement when you set up your camber. So keep that in mind for the narrow hexes. And what else? We have these very popular option parts, which are the ball bearing drive shafts for the front and the rear. And these come in different lengths. You have the 58mm fronts, which are the same as the kit drive shafts, and 54mm rears. But we also offer these in 57 front and 52mm rears. So, for example, going to a shorter front drive shaft makes the car more initially aggressive, takes away a bit of mid-corner grip, if you may, but the same for the rear. Going to a shorter rear drive shaft will free up the car, give you more rotation, but it will take away grip on that end of the car. So generally I recommend the 58 and 54, but you can fine-tune the handling with the 57 and 52. The ball bearing drive shafts have a significant performance increase over the standard drive shafts because the little ball bearings that go between the drive shaft and out drives on the diff and the spool, they reduce the friction, which frees up the car and makes the car smoother on direction change, makes it less likely to traction roll, makes it nicer and smoother, and definitely increases cornering speed. So the team drivers in general, they use these on both the front and the rear of the car. They're very nice option parts indeed, which I warmly recommend. Together with those drive shafts, you'll need to use the specific out drives. So solid axle and diff out drives, which are made specifically for the ball bearing drive shafts. You will not be able to use the ball bearing drive shafts with the kit out drives. They will not fit, so you'll need to purchase these. Furthermore, we have the low friction drive belts. The low friction belts are mainly recommended for stock racing because they free up the car. They do what they claim to do, which is they reduce the friction, so the drivetrain will be freer and you'll have a more efficient drivetrain with less drag, which is definitely beneficial for stock racing especially. So it's the same length belt front and rear, so you'll need two of them. They're sold individually. The rear T-brace is another option which returns for the X4, and of course this has been a standard part on the T421. It was an option part on the T420, and the T-brace is not as often used on the X4 as on the T4, but still it's a very useful option part for the sake of tuning the flex of the car and adding or removing screws to these different spots on the T-brace, which you can use to fine-tune the handling of the car. Adding the T-brace and especially adding screws to it, the stiffer you make it, the more rotation you'll remove from the car. The more stable it will be, especially on direction change, and the less likely it will be the traction roll. So highly recommended for high grip conditions especially, but not essential as it was in the past on the T4. And I have these dual steering arm screws, which they mount on top of the steering. So I'm gonna showcase these on my car here. They're mounted here on my X4 on top of the steering arms to reduce the play up and down. So they not only look good, but they also reduce the play of the steering, which makes the steering more direct and more predictable. So those screws are recommended. And we have the X4 graphite steering plate set, which this steering plate goes on top of the steering to reinforce the steering. It removes flex from the steering, makes the car feel more direct. It will turn in harder, which is useful on certain conditions where you need more initial steering from the car. So that's a nice option to fine-tune the handling of the car, since flex is always a very important variable on the setup. And this is something that's one of my favorite option parts is the PSS, the progressive shock system. Comes in pairs. these little aluminum sleeves are sold in pairs, and they go into the shock body. It has a V shape, as you can see. So this means that you'll mount these together with solid pistons specifically made for the PSS, which it makes the damping progressive. So when the piston is traveling up in the shock body, it becomes progressively harder. So these can really make the car more aggressive compared to the regular style pistons. And if you use them on the front of the car, you'll prevent the car from diving as hard on the nose, which can help to improve cornering speeds for stock classes. Or if you use them in the front and the rear, you'll improve the overall grip of the car. You'll have more forward bite, the car will be more aggressive, more responsive. So highly recommended for both carpet and asphalt, actually, in front and rear. And the other benefit of using the PSS is that you can fine-tune the hardness of the shock with the shock length, because as the piston sits in the sleeve, it'll get hotter obviously when it travels up. So you can set the shock length to fine-tune the hardness depending on the starting point then of the piston inside of the sleeve. So that's very trick and very nice to have PSS. And another option part, which is one of my favorites, is something that's completely new for the X4, is the nickel-coated brass weights, which they mount onto the motor mount. So either at the front or the back of the motor mount. So in the very center of the car, here below the spur gear, or here at the back next to the motor. So right in the center of the car, they don't affect the front to rear weight bias at all, because it's in the middle of the car. And they're super nice. They don't affect the flex of the car, because you screw them onto the motor mount itself, and they sit super low and right in the center of the car. And I really like these. They're very cool. To keep talking about weights, we have these shorty lipo weights, which are sold in pairs of 2. They're 40 gram heavy, each one of them. They're brass weights. And these are used together with the shorty batteries. So if you're racing modified on carpet, you can use a shorty pack. This very small battery, which you can see here. It has a low center of gravity, and it mounts here with these optional brass weights. So you just put your standard battery mounting system onto these brass weights, and you can have a perfect solution for mounting a shorty battery in the car. So important for modified racing on carpet. Let's keep on talking about weights. We have the 12 gram tungsten chassis weight, which I'm going to demonstrate where this is installed. I mean, you can install it here on the chassis, which I've done on this side, but you can also install this where it's made to be, which is on the bottom of the chassis here. Right here, there's a little slot for it on the chassis, so you can mount it directly here, super low, close to the floor to keep the CG low. And you'll need to use a special thin double-sided tape, which Hoodie offers, to fit this onto the chassis. And we also have this brand new Hoodie pure tungsten weight, which is a screw-on weight. You screw this to the chassis, so you don't need to use any tape. And the benefit is that it's conical, so it's not flat on the bottom, so it doesn't fixate onto the chassis and make the chassis stiffer. It just fixates here in the middle and doesn't affect the chassis flex very much at all. So that's a real nice tungsten weight, very low center of gravity weight. And last but not least, we also offer these larger tungsten weights, which you mount these onto the chassis. These are mainly made to be mounted under your electronics. So you can mount these under your speedo on the left side of the car if you use a spec racing speedo, which is very light. and you struggle to make the car up to weight, and you can use these tungsten weights under your electronics. They're super thin, and tungsten is a very dense material, so it'll keep the CG super low, and the weight is where you want it to be, basically. So mainly recommended for spec racing, but you can also use these underneath your receiver, further towards the front of the car. Those are all the recommended option parts that I had in mind for the X4, and there's more option parts, of course, but these are the most important ones. So thanks for watching, and let me know if you have any questions.